Brian, a 9-year-old boy, already knew more about pain than any other child his age. He lived in a small, rundown trailer in the suburbs of a town forgotten by society. His mother, Olivia, a worn-out woman marked by suffering, struggled to survive each day, especially when her husband, Josh, came home drunk, as he usually did. That night, the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, and the wind pounded against the rusty walls of the trailer. The sound of shouting and breaking glass echoed, but for the neighbors, it had become a familiar noise. Josh stumbled in, a bottle of whiskey in hand, his eyes bloodshot with rage. He shouted incoherent words, cursing at Olivia, who was already cowering in a corner of the room. Brian, hiding behind the door of the tiny bedroom, watched in silence, his heart racing. He knew what was coming. "You're useless. You're good for nothing," Josh yelled, raising his fist. Olivia tried to dodge, but she was too weak. The first shove came with the force of years of frustration and alcoholism. Her body hit the floor hard, and Brian, unable to bear the scene, rushed forward. Before Josh could land another blow, the boy threw himself over his mother, using his small body to shield her.
"No. Stop."
"Don't hurt my mom," Brian shouted, his voice cracked with pain and fear. Josh hesitated for a second, surprised by the boy's bravery, but soon a crooked smile spread across his face. "Oh, you want to play hero, kid?" He slapped Brian, hitting him on the side. The boy felt the sharp pain spread through his body, but he stood firm, covering his mother. More kicks and slaps followed, but Brian didn't give in. He knew that if he moved, his mother wouldn't survive. Olivia's eyes, swollen and filled with tears, met Brian's. "No, my son, please go," she whispered, trying to push him away. But Brian didn't move. He clung to his mother's battered body, feeling his own breaking little by little. Josh, tired and more intoxicated by the minute, finally stopped, muttering something unintelligible before collapsing onto the sofa and passing out completely. That night, Brian cried in silence. Not for himself, but for his mother, who no longer had the strength to fight. Ever since she had moved in with Josh, he had drained everything out of her. She no longer smiled, no longer played. She just cried in the corners, and Brian was sure she was depressed. The next morning, bruises covering his body, Brian got up before his mother woke. He put on his school clothes, which barely hid the injuries, and headed to class. At school, his teacher Eva, a woman with a keen eye and a generous heart, immediately noticed something was wrong. Brian was quieter than usual, walking slowly, as if each step was an effort. "Brian, come here for a moment," Eva gently called to him as he put away his books. He hesitated but walked over. When she touched his shoulder, he winced in pain. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Brian lowered his head, too afraid to look her in the eye. He knew that if he told the truth, things could get worse at home. But Eva was persistent, and she wouldn't let the matter drop easily. "You can trust me," she said, kneeling to meet his eye level. Even so, Brian stayed silent. Eva's eyes, filled with compassion, caught sight of the poorly hidden bruises beneath his shirt. She didn't ask anything else at that moment, but in her heart, she knew something terrible was happening in the boy's life. "Here, take my phone number. You can call me for anything," she said, kneeling again to meet his eyes. In the days that followed, Eva kept a close watch on Brian. She tried to talk to him a few more times, but the boy always changed the subject or pretended everything was fine. Until one night, everything changed. That night, Brian cried in silence. Not for himself, but for his mother, who no longer had the strength to fight. Ever since she had moved in with Josh, he had drained everything that his mother used to be. She no longer smiled, no longer played. She just cried in corners, and he was certain she was depressed. The next morning, bruised all over, Brian got up before his mother woke. He dressed in his school clothes, which barely hid the marks, and went to class. At school, his teacher Eva, a woman with a sharp eye and a kind heart, noticed something was off the moment she saw him. Brian was quieter than usual, walking slowly, as if every step took effort. "Brian, Come here for a moment, Eva gently asked as he put his books away. He hesitated but approached. When she touched his shoulder, he flinched in pain. What happened? She asked, her voice full of concern. Brian lowered his head, too scared to meet her eyes. He knew if he told the truth, things could get worse at home. But Eva was persistent, and she wouldn't let it go easily. You can trust me, she said, kneeling down to his level. Even so, Brian remained silent. Eva's compassionate eyes spotted the bruises poorly hidden under his shirt. She didn't ask any more questions at that moment, but in her heart, she knew something terrible was happening in the boy's life. Here's my phone number. You can call me for anything, she said, kneeling again to meet his gaze. In the following days, Eva kept a close eye on Brian. She tried talking to him several more times, but the boy always changed the subject or pretended everything was fine. Until one night, everything changed. That night, the shouting started earlier. The cold wind blew through the cracks of the trailer, and the sound of a whiskey bottle smashing against a table echoed through the small space. Josh, drunker than usual, was out of control. Olivia tried to avoid any sudden movements, already knowing what was coming. Brian, sitting on his bed, hugged his knees, listening to every sound like a warning. He knew the pattern. The insults first, then the blows.
But something felt different that night.
Josh seemed angrier, his screams louder, and the fear in Brian's heart grew. You whore. I support you. You're nothing. Nothing without me. Josh yelled, raising his hand at Olivia. The slap echoed through the trailer, and Olivia fell to the ground, groaning in pain. Brian jumped up immediately, his bare feet touching the cold floor. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. His body still hurt from the previous blows, but he ignored the pain. Something inside him was growing, something he couldn't control anymore. Anger. He ran into the living room and saw Josh, wild-eyed, holding his mother by the arm, ready to strike again. Without thinking, Brian shouted, "Stop." His voice, stronger than ever, made Josh hesitate for a brief second. Olivia, lying on the floor, looked at her son with a mix of despair and fear. She knew what could happen if Brian stood up to Josh like this. "Brian," she begged, but it was too late. Josh turned, laughing as he took a step toward the boy. "Oh, the brave little kid is back," he muttered with contempt. "You want to play the man of the house now." Brian, eyes filled with tears of hatred, looked at his stepfather and said something he had never had the courage to say before. "I'm not afraid of you." The words came out firm, surprising even him. Josh, enraged by the defiance, swung a punch, but Brian, quick, dodged and shoved Josh with all the strength his small body could muster. The stepfather, too drunk to keep his balance, stumbled backward, hitting his head hard against the corner of the table. Silence filled the trailer. Olivia gasped, horrified, as Josh collapsed to the floor, motionless. Blood trickled from his head, quickly forming a pool. Brian, still in shock, stared at his hands, unable to believe what he had just done.
"Mom."
His voice was low, barely a whisper. He won't hurt you anymore." Olivia, in a state of panic, crawled over to Josh, shaking him desperately. But he didn't move. Desperation overtook her, and tears streamed down her face. She knew, just as Brian did, that Josh was dead. "What have we done?" Olivia whispered, looking at her son with wide, terrified eyes. "My boy." Brian, still frozen, didn't know what to say. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, and everything around him seemed to spin. The sound of police tires crunching the gravel shattered the night's silence. The police, called by a concerned neighbor, arrived before they could fully process what had happened. 2 officers entered the trailer, guns drawn, ready to contain any violence. But when they saw the scene, one of them lowered his weapon and approached slowly. "What happened here?" the officer asked, his face stern. Olivia spoke first. "It was me. He was going to hit me, and I pushed him." Brian, still in shock, lifted his head and, in a low voice, said, I pushed him. He was hitting my mom." The officers exchanged quick glances, assessing the situation. One of them grabbed the radio and called for backup and an ambulance, even though they knew Josh was already dead. Eva, Brian's teacher who lived nearby, arrived at the trailer shortly after. She knew what had happened the moment she saw the state of the place and the lost look on Brian's face. Her heart tightened, and she rushed over to the boy, kneeling beside him. "Brian, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. "I just wanted him to stop," Brian murmured, the tears finally spilling from his eyes. Eva hugged him tightly, trying to comfort him as chaos unfolded around them. The officers spoke quietly to one another, and soon, one approached Eva. "We'll have to take the boy into custody. This was a death, and he's involved," the officer explained, his voice firm but laced with compassion. Eva stood up quickly, still holding Brian's hand.
No.
"You can't take him into custody. You don't know what this boy has been through," she exclaimed, trying to hold back her desperation. The officer looked at her for a moment, considering her words. "I'll take responsibility," Eva continued. "I'll take care of him and his mother. They don't have anyone. Let me help. I have an organization that will give them a new life. I volunteer there." After a long pause, the officer sighed and nodded, realizing there was no better option. Eva then hugged Brian again, feeling the relief mixed with the weight of what was to come. Their battle was far from over. Eva didn't waste any time. After the officers gave their permission, she helped Olivia stand up, and Brian, still in shock, held tightly to his teacher's hand. Josh's body was taken away by the police, but the marks of that night would stay with them forever. Eva led them to her car, a modest station wagon she used for school. During the drive, the silence was almost suffocating. Olivia sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but seeing nothing. Brian, in the back seat, remained quiet, hugging his legs, trembling with exhaustion and fear. "It's going to be okay now, Brian. I'm here, and I'll be the mother you need," Olivia whispered, turning to him through the rearview mirror. But he didn't respond. He simply closed his eyes, trying to escape, even if just for a few minutes, from the pain that throbbed both in his body and soul. Eva took them to an organization she had known for years, a shelter for women who had fled abusive relationships. New Hope House was its name. The building, simple but welcoming, was tucked away from the city center, surrounded by trees and a small garden. It was a safe place, a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. As soon as they arrived, a staff member named Clara greeted them. A middle-aged woman with a warm smile, Clara seemed to understand, with just one look, everything that had happened to those seeking shelter. "You must be Olivia and Brian," Clara said softly, bending down to look at Brian, who remained closed off. "It's going to be all right now. Come on, let's go inside." Olivia seemed to be on autopilot, following Clara down the hallway, while Eva walked beside her, offering support. Clara led them to a small room at the back of the shelter, with 2 beds and a simple dresser. The window, open, let in the cool night breeze, a wind that seemed to ease, if only slightly, the suffocating weight of reality. "This will be your room for now," Clara said. "You'll be safe here. We have a few rules, but the most important thing is that you'll get the support you need to start over. Tomorrow, Olivia, I can show you the training courses we offer. Many of the women here find good jobs after finishing." Olivia nodded mechanically. She sat on the edge of one of the beds, her eyes still distant, unable to process everything that had happened. Her life, already marked by so much suffering, seemed to have finally reached an irreversible point. Brian, on the other hand, didn't let go of Eva's hand. Clara sensed the tension in the air and turned to Olivia. "He can stay with you if that makes him feel more comfortable," Clara suggested, with a gentle smile. Olivia looked at Brian, who remained silent. She knew he was afraid, and even though she was exhausted, she wouldn't leave him alone. Not after everything. "Yes, he can stay with me tonight," Olivia replied, softly stroking Brian's hair. Clara left with a sympathetic glance, closing the door behind her. Eva helped Brian lie down on the bed and covered him with a soft blanket. He continued to tremble slightly, his eyes swollen from crying. Eva sat beside him, holding his hand firmly. "You are so brave, Brian," she whispered. "I know you're confused right now, but you saved me." My baby became my hero so fast. I promise to be the mother you need." He didn't respond but squeezed her hand, as if that simple gesture was the only thing keeping him grounded in reality. Sleep quickly overcame the boy, exhausted both physically and emotionally. Olivia, however, stayed awake for a long time, her heart heavy with what the future would bring. The next morning, Clara prepared a simple but nutritious breakfast. Eva, already familiar with the routines of the organization, helped serve Olivia and Brian. They ate in silence, but the atmosphere was slightly lighter. The sun shone outside, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the nightmare of the previous night was far away. "Olivia, we offer some courses here that can help you find a job," Clara began, trying to bring a little hope to the visibly broken woman. "We have cooking classes, sewing, and even training for office assistants. We can talk more about it when you're ready." Olivia looked at Clara, her eyes tired, but with a glimmer of hope beginning to surface. She knew she had to be strong for Brian. If not for herself, then for him. I want to do it," Olivia replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to start over for him." Eva smiled, feeling a small victory in seeing Olivia finally respond. Meanwhile, Brian quietly watched, slowly eating his bread. He listened to the conversations around him, but his mind was still trapped in the events of the previous night. The image of Josh's body, lying on the floor, haunted him. He knew that things had changed forever. In the following days, Olivia began attending the classes at the shelter, showing a quiet determination to rebuild her life. Brian, little by little, returned to school, but he still carried the weight of that invisible burden. Eva never left him alone, always there for anything he needed. But the shadow of the police investigation still loomed over them. A detective had been assigned to investigate Josh's death, and with each visit, Olivia trembled with fear, afraid they would take her son away. But Eva, steadfast in her promise, made sure that didn't happen. Finally, weeks later, the case was closed. The detective, after concluding that Brian had acted in self-defense to protect his mother, filed the case away. When the news reached the shelter, Olivia broke down in tears, relieved that she hadn't lost her son to the system. But the biggest shock came later. That same day, Eva was called to the police station with Olivia and Brian. There, the detective, with an unexpected smile, handed Brian a small medal. "This is for you, kid. You were a hero in protecting your mother," said the detective. Brian, still processing what it all meant, looked at the medal in his hands. It wasn't grand, but to him, that small object represented something much bigger. He had saved his mother. It wasn't just a medal, it was a symbol that, at last, the nightmare was over. The weeks following the closing of the case brought an unexpected calm to Brian and his mother. Life at the shelter began to stabilize, and Olivia threw herself into the courses offered with an almost obsessive dedication. Meanwhile, Brian returned to school, trying to re-establish a routine that, though it didn't erase the memories of violence, offered him some comfort. Yet, even amid the apparent normality, the ghosts of that fateful night still haunted him. At school, Eva continued to watch Brian closely. She noticed how he distanced himself from the other students, avoiding conversation or play. Despite her efforts to help him integrate, Brian seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. He was only 7, but the trauma had aged him in a silent and cruel way. One day, after class, Eva asked Brian to stay behind for a private talk. They sat in the small chairs of the classroom, and the afternoon sun lit up Brian's face, which remained downcast. "Brian, how are you feeling?" Eva asked gently, trying to reach the boy's thoughts. He didn't respond right away. He stayed silent, staring at his small, thin hands that still trembled from time to time, as if his body couldn't forget the violence. "I don't know," he finally replied, his voice low and distant. "Sometimes I think it's all still happening. That when I go home, he'll be there." Eva felt a pang of sadness hearing that. Brian still couldn't accept that Josh was no longer a threat. "I know it's hard," Eva said, leaning in a little closer. "But you and your mom are safe now. No one's going to hurt you, Brian. You did something very brave to protect her." "But I killed him," Brian murmured, finally lifting his gaze to meet the teacher's. What if that makes me a bad person? Those words, so heavy for someone so young, broke Eva's heart. She took Brian's small hands, feeling the fragility and strength that coexisted within him. Listen to me, Brian. You are not a bad person. What happened was a tragedy, but you acted to save your mother. You protected her when no one else could. That doesn't make you a bad person, she said, trying to reassure him with every word. He looked at her for a long moment, tears welling up in his eyes but not falling. Brian was determined to keep his composure, as if crying would be a sign of weakness. But Eva knew he was struggling. She knew that this child needed more than words to heal. I wish things were different, Brian admitted, almost in a whisper. But I never wanted to hurt anyone. Eva squeezed his hands a little tighter, never breaking eye contact with him. I know that, and we all know that. You're a good person, Brian. Never forget that. Brian nodded, but he still seemed far from fully believing it. The trauma of taking a life, even in defense of another, was something he would carry for a long time. Eva knew that his journey would be a long one, but she wasn't about to give up on him. While Brian faced his internal battles, Olivia fought her own. She had started taking the sewing course at the shelter and seemed to be improving day by day. Each piece she sewed, every stitch she aligned, was a step toward rebuilding her self-esteem, which had been destroyed by years of abuse. Eva visited her frequently at the shelter, always bringing updates about Brian, hoping it would ease the mother's heart. During one of these visits, Olivia seemed more confident, her posture less slouched than usual. It was clear that, slowly, she was becoming who she used to be before Josh had taken control of her life. You know, Eva, I'm starting to feel like maybe we have a chance at a normal life, Olivia confessed, as she sewed a simple dress for one of the shelter's clients. Something I never thought was possible. But Brian, he's still so distant. He doesn't talk about what happened. I see him shutting down more each day. Eva sighed, sitting down beside Olivia at the small sewing table. He's struggling, Olivia. Just like you. But he's strong, stronger than you think. He just needs time to process everything. But what if I'm not strong enough to help him? Olivia questioned, her hands pausing from sewing for a moment. I failed so much as a mother before. I didn't protect him. I didn't stop him from going through all of that. Eva took one of Olivia's hands and squeezed it tightly. You're here now, and you're making changes. That's what matters. You both went through hell, but you're alive, and that's already a victory. Believe me, Olivia, you didn't fail. And Brian needs you more than ever right now. Olivia nodded, though with some reluctance. She knew the process would be long, but she was willing to fight. If not for herself, then for Brian. That weekend, Eva decided to take Brian on a different kind of outing. She picked him up from the shelter and took him to a nearby park with a peaceful lake and few people around. She wanted to give him a space where he could breathe, away from the curious stares and the constant weight that seemed to follow him. They sat on a wooden bench, and the sound of the calm waters was almost therapeutic. Brian stared at the lake without saying a word, but there was something in his posture that seemed a little less tense than usual. When I was little, my mom used to bring me here, Eva began, gently trying to open a conversation. She always said this lake was magical, that anything you said here would come true. Brian looked at her with a curious expression, though he knew it was just a story. And did you believe that? He asked. I did. Kids always want to believe in magic, don't they? Eva replied with a smile, remembering her own childhood. There was a moment of silence as Brian thought about what she had said. If it were true, what would you say? He asked softly. Eva thought for a second, leaning forward slightly to look at the calm waters of the lake. I think I'd say the world needs to be a kinder place for people like you, Brian. And that you deserve to be happy. Brian looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't ready to believe in happiness yet, but something in Eva's words touched a dormant part of him. Maybe, just maybe, the world could be a different place. Eva, watching the boy beside her, knew there was still a long road ahead, but that small glimmer of hope was all she needed to keep going. Things seemed to be slowly falling into place for Olivia and Brian. The weeks at the shelter turned into months, and the routine began to bring a sense of normalcy. Olivia, dedicated to her sewing classes, was starting to take on orders from outside the shelter, earning her first money in years. It wasn't much, but it meant a lot. It was the freedom she thought she'd never have again. Brian, on the other hand, still lived in the shadows of the past. Though his school performance hadn't suffered, Eva could see how emotionally distant he remained, even from her. Their conversations were brief and always tinged with an air of uncertainty, as if the boy was constantly waiting for something bad to happen. One day, after class, as he packed up his things, Brian overheard Eva talking about an upcoming event. "Brian, on Saturday we're going on a school trip to the city museum. It would be a great opportunity for you to go with your friends and have some fun." Brian hesitated. The idea of leaving the shelter, of being surrounded by so many people, made him anxious. He didn't feel ready. The world outside the shelter still seemed frightening, full of uncertainties. He shook his head, not looking up. "No, I don't want to go," he said quietly. Eva crouched down beside him, speaking gently.
It'll be fun, Brian.
"You don't have to be scared. I'll be there, making sure everything's okay." He bit his lip, still unsure. The world Eva was trying to show him felt distant from the one he knew. But before he could respond, the door to the classroom swung open. Clara, the shelter's assistant, entered, breathless, her face pale with worry. "Eva, you need to come back to the shelter. Something's happened," she said, the urgency in her voice making Eva's heart race. "What happened?" Eva stood up immediately, feeling the weight of new tension in the air. Clara took a deep breath before speaking. "The detective who handled Brian's case, he's back. It seems new information has come up about Josh. They want to talk to Olivia." Something about the investigation wasn't clear before. Eva went pale. The relief everyone had felt when the case was closed began to dissolve. She knew how much this could affect Olivia, and even more, how it could devastate Brian. Without wasting time, she grabbed her bag and motioned for Brian to follow her. "Let's go. We need to get back to the shelter now." Brian felt his heart race. He knew something bad was coming. Just hearing Josh's name was enough to awaken a deep, almost paralyzing fear within him. But he followed Eva without question. When they arrived at the shelter, the atmosphere was tense. Olivia sat in a chair in the common room, her eyes filled with fear. Next to her were a police officer and the detective who had previously investigated Josh's case, speaking in low voices. Brian hesitated at the doorway, his whole body trembling. He knew this couldn't be good. Eva walked straight to Olivia. "What's going on?" Eva asked, her voice firm but clearly worried. The detective stood up, holding a small clipboard with notes. He looked at Eva seriously, but his tone was calm. "We received a new report. Someone who knew Josh. It seems he was involved in a trafficking ring. This changes some things about the case. We're here to reassess the possibility that his death wasn't just a domestic dispute. There could be other implications." Eva felt a wave of shock course through her. Olivia, who had been mostly silent, finally spoke up. "I didn't know anything," she said, her voice shaking. "Josh never talked about that with me. I never knew." The detective watched her for a moment before continuing. "We're not saying you knew, Olivia, but we need to reopen the investigation and understand if others are involved. This could also affect Brian. Depending on what we find, we might need to reevaluate what happened that night." Brian, overhearing the conversation from the hallway, stepped back, feeling as though the ground was crumbling beneath him. Everything he thought was resolved, everything he had fought so hard to overcome, was back, darker and more threatening than ever. He ran outside, his chest tight, tears threatening to fall. Eva noticed and quickly followed him. She found Brian sitting by a flower bed, curled up, his face buried in his knees. "Brian," Eva whispered, kneeling beside him. He didn't lift his head, but his trembling voice came out between sobs. I knew this wasn't over. I just wanted it all to go away, but nothing goes away, nothing." Eva's heart broke for him. This small, wounded boy was being pulled back into a nightmare he had barely escaped. She placed a hand on his back, trying to comfort him. "You're strong, Brian. I know it seems unfair. And it is. But you're not alone. We'll get through this together. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes red and full of tears. What if they take me? He asked, his voice filled with fear. What if I'm the one to blame again? Eva immediately shook her head, holding his face gently in both hands. That won't happen, Brian. What you did was protect your mom, and no one can take that away from you. I'll fight for you. Olivia will fight for you. And this time, you're going to come out of this stronger than ever. Brian looked at her for a long moment, searching her eyes for the reassurance that what she said was true. He wanted to believe her, but the fear still loomed, reminding him that nothing was certain. They went back inside the shelter, where the detective was wrapping up his conversation with Olivia. Before leaving, he turned to Eva. We'll need you to come to the station next week for further clarification. I know this is hard, but we need to resolve this as soon as possible, he said, then left. Eva nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. But she knew there was no time for hesitation. Olivia stood up slowly, walking over to Brian and hugging him. We're going to be okay, my son, she whispered, trying to believe her own words. Brian, still hesitant, simply hugged her back, feeling small again. But this time, there was a difference. As he looked at Eva and his mother, he realized that he wasn't alone anymore. In the days leading up to their visit to the station, Eva worked hard to keep Brian focused. She continued encouraging him at school, trying to break down the emotional walls he had built around himself. Olivia, despite her own inner struggles, did her best to be present for her son, showing a strength she didn't know she had. But something was changing inside Brian. The fear was slowly being replaced by a quiet anger, a frustration that the past refused to let him live in peace. This new anger was beginning to shape his decisions, and Eva noticed it. She knew she needed to act before it consumed him. Their trip to the station was scheduled for the next day, and Eva knew that it would be the moment when Brian would have to face his deepest fears once again. The day at the police station arrived, and the weight of what was coming felt heavier than ever for Brian. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning in bed as he tried to push away the nightmares that continued to haunt him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Josh lying on the floor, motionless, and heard his mother's screams echoing around him. Even though he knew he had acted to protect Olivia, the guilt still gnawed at him. Eva arrived at the shelter early that morning, ready to accompany Brian and Olivia to the station. The tension was palpable in the air as she entered the room. Olivia was pale, her eyes hollow with worry, but she was trying to stay calm for her son's sake. Brian, silent, sat at the table, his eyes fixed on the floor, with no desire to speak. Ready to go? Eva asked softly, trying not to add to the already heavy mood. Olivia nodded, taking Brian's hand, and even though he was hesitant, he followed his mother and teacher to the car. During the drive to the station, the silence was almost unbearable. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, fearing what might happen. When they arrived at the station, they were met by the detective leading the case. He guided them to a small room where Olivia and Brian sat side by side, with Eva nearby, always vigilant. The detective flipped through some papers, the sound of the pages turning being the only noise in the room. Finally, he looked up at the family and began to speak. After further investigation, we've discovered some connections between Josh and illegal activities. It seems he was involved in a drug trafficking ring, something he kept hidden for many years. This raises new questions about what happened that night. We need to understand if Josh's death is tied to these activities. Olivia was shocked, covering her mouth with her hands, while Brian, though frightened, tried to process everything. He knew Josh was violent, knew he hurt his mother, but he had never imagined there was something more behind it. What does this mean for us? Eva asked, her voice firm but laced with concern. The detective sighed, crossing his arms on the table. It means we need to clarify all the details. We know Brian acted in self-defense, but there are those who might believe Josh's death was premeditated or connected to his involvement in trafficking. There are dangerous people in this world who may want to settle scores. That's absurd. Olivia interrupted, her voice finally finding strength. Brian was only trying to protect me. He would never hurt anyone on purpose. "We know that, Olivia," the detective replied, trying to stay calm. "But we need to make sure you both are safe. With Josh's involvement in this world, there are risks for both of you." Brian, still processing everything, felt a wave of fear. He hadn't thought that this could go beyond Josh's death. He hadn't thought that maybe the danger wasn't over. "And what's going to happen to me?" Brian asked, his voice trembling. The detective looked directly at the boy, his expression softening. "We're not here to blame you, Brian. We know what happened. You acted to protect your mother. But we need to make sure you stay safe. There might be people who come looking for answers or even revenge. We need to be prepared for that." Those words hit Brian like a punch to the stomach. He had killed Josh to protect his mother, but now it seemed that even after Josh's death, the danger remained. Once again, he felt responsible for everything. Eva, sensing the impact this was having on him, placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. "Don't worry, Brian. We won't let anything happen to you or your mother. We're in this together." The detective then explained that the police would increase security around the shelter and take measures to ensure that no one from Josh's criminal circle could get near them. Olivia, still in shock, could hardly believe what she was hearing. Everything she and Brian had fought to overcome was becoming complicated again. In the days that followed, the tension at the shelter only grew. Olivia spent most of her time locked in her room, sewing in silence, as if each stitch she passed through the needle was an effort to stitch together her own sanity. Brian, on the other hand, withdrew more and more. He went to school but avoided talking to his classmates, and even Eva found it difficult to reach him. The weight of everything that was happening seemed to be suffocating him. Eva knew she had to do something before Brian became completely lost in his own dark thoughts. One morning, after class, she called him for a talk in the schoolyard, away from the curious eyes of the other students. "Brian, you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" Eva began, trying to create a safe space for him to open up. He didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes on the ground, lightly kicking a small stone with his foot. "I just wish this would all end," he finally said, his voice low and filled with exhaustion. "I wish Josh had never come into my life. I wish none of this had ever happened." Eva's heart ached. She knew that no words could truly ease Brian's pain, but she couldn't let him face it alone. "I know, Brian, but what you need to understand is that none of this is your fault. What happened wasn't your fault. You don't have to carry this weight forever." Brian finally looked up at Eva, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed to let his emotions flow without trying to hold them back. "But I killed him. I pushed him, and he died," he said, his eyes beginning to fill with tears. "And now everything's worse. Even after he's gone, everything's still wrong." Eva took a deep breath, struggling to keep her own composure in the face of Brian's suffering. What happened was a tragedy, but it was an accident. And now, all that matters is that you and your mom are safe. And we're here to make sure you stay that way. Brian bit his lip, trying to hold back the tears, but he couldn't. He began to cry, and Eva wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly. The boy broke down, releasing all the fear and pain he had been holding inside. And there, in that moment, he finally allowed himself to feel the vulnerability he had been trying to hide. "I'm so scared, miss," he whispered between sobs. "What if they come after us? What if everything gets worse again?" Eva gently stroked Brian's hair, holding him as he cried. "I won't let anything bad happen, Brian. I won't let them hurt you. We'll get through this. You're not alone." In the days that followed, security around the shelter was reinforced and the investigation into Josh's activities continued. Although the police kept a close eye on Olivia and Brian, the fear still lingered. But little by little, Brian began to open up again. The weight of his guilt, though still present, was starting to lift with the help of Eva and his mother. Olivia, too, began to realize that despite all the suffering they had endured, there was a chance to start over. The shadows of the past were far from gone, but with the support of Eva and the shelter's community, she and Brian were rebuilding a life that, though fragile, was their own. Yet, the danger still lurked, waiting for the right moment to strike. The days at the shelter began to settle into a more stable routine, though the tension never completely disappeared. Olivia continued with her sewing course, taking on more and more orders, and the money she earned brought a faint sense of independence, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Brian, on the other hand, still wrestled with his own demons. The fear and guilt, though lessened by Eva's support, followed him like persistent shadows. However, something in the air felt different. One day, after returning from school, Brian noticed that the security around the shelter seemed more relaxed. The police officers who used to patrol frequently now only made occasional rounds, and Clara, the shelter assistant, had mentioned that the threats seemed to have decreased over time. But Brian couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. One night, after Olivia had gone to bed, Brian woke up to a faint sound outside the shelter. His heart raced. He got out of bed quietly, opened the small window in his room, and peeked through the gap. In the courtyard, shadows moved stealthily near the fence surrounding the shelter. Brian felt his blood run cold. The fear he had been trying so hard to control surged back with full force. He knew that even though Josh's investigation was closed, there were still dangerous people who might want revenge. The thought that someone could be watching the shelter paralyzed him. He needed to act, but his body was frozen with terror. With trembling hands, he carefully closed the window and ran to his mother's room. Olivia was sound asleep, exhausted after another long day of work at the shelter. He hesitated to wake her, but he knew he couldn't handle this alone.
Mom.
Brian whispered, gently shaking her arm. Mom, wake up. Olivia opened her eyes slowly, blinking to adjust to the darkness. When she saw Brian's face, pale with fear, she sat up immediately. What is it, sweetheart? She asked, concerned. There's someone outside. I think they're watching the shelter, Brian whispered, his voice trembling. Olivia felt a wave of panic, but tried to stay calm for Brian. She knew she couldn't let fear take over. She needed to be strong, for herself and for her son. Stay here. I'm going to get Eva, Olivia said quickly, getting up and hurrying into the hallway. She knocked on Eva's door, which was nearby. A few seconds later, Eva opened it, already sensing the tension in the air. What happened? She asked, visibly alarmed. Brian saw someone in the yard, Olivia said, her voice low but full of worry. I think it could be someone connected to Josh. Eva didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone immediately and called the police. While they waited, she instructed Olivia to stay with Brian in the room and lock the door for safety. The shelter's security was good, but they couldn't take any chances. The next few minutes were tense, with every sound outside amplified by the night's silence. Brian's heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. He sat next to his mother, gripping her hand tightly. I won't let anyone hurt you again, Brian murmured, almost like a promise to himself. Olivia pulled him close, hugging him. She knew how hard this was for him, and despite all her own fear, she felt a growing strength in her son. He was no longer the defenseless child he used to be. There was now a determination in his eyes, a courage born from the chaos they had endured. A few minutes later, the police arrived. 2 patrol cars parked outside the shelter, and the officers, flashlights in hand, began searching the perimeter. Eva went outside to meet them, explaining the situation. The detective handling Josh's case arrived soon after, looking worried. We found recent footprints near the fence, but whoever was here is already gone, one of the officers said after the initial search. We'll increase surveillance and keep a closer watch on the area. Is this serious? Eva asked the detective while the officers continued their inspection. Could it be someone connected to Josh's case? The detective sighed, looking tired. It's possible. Even though the case is closed, Josh had dangerous connections. Maybe someone came looking for answers or revenge. We'll investigate further. A chill ran down Eva's spine. This was what everyone had feared from the start. Even after Josh's death, the consequences of his actions still hung over Brian and Olivia. After their conversation, the police decided to leave a patrol car stationed outside the shelter for the night as a precaution. Eva returned inside, finding Olivia and Brian still locked in the room. They're gone now, but the police will stay here for the time being, Eva explained, trying to reassure them. You're safe. I promise. Olivia nodded, but the tension in her shoulders was clear. She knew that even with the security, this wasn't the life she wanted for Brian. They couldn't stay in the shelter forever, living in constant fear of being found. Something had to change. Brian, however, felt differently. While Eva and Olivia discussed what to do next, he began to realize that this fight, this need to protect his mother, was now his responsibility too. He couldn't run away. For the first time, instead of being overwhelmed by fear, he felt a growing inner strength. He wouldn't let Josh, or his dark legacy, control them forever. In the following days, security around the shelter was tightened, and Brian continued to watch everything closely. Something inside him had shifted that night. The anger and fear were still there, but now they were fueled by a determination he didn't yet fully understand. Eva noticed the change in Brian's behavior. He seemed more focused, more aware of the details around him. But at the same time, there was a danger in that. The boy was beginning to carry the burden of being the protector, something that shouldn't rest on the shoulders of someone so young. One afternoon, while walking out of school with Eva, Brian finally spoke about what he was feeling. "Miss, I can't keep running away," he said with a firmness that surprised Eva. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to protect my mom." Eva stopped, turning to him with a worried look. "Brian, you've already done so much for your mom. You shouldn't have to carry this weight alone. You're still a child. You don't have to be the hero all the time." But Brian shook his head resolutely. "I'm not a child anymore, not after everything that happened. He tried to hurt my mom, and now other people might too. I won't let that happen." Eva was silent for a moment, realizing that, in a way, he was right. Brian had been through more in his 7 years than many adults had, and it had changed him in profound ways. But she also knew he needed to be protected, needed the chance to just be a kid. "I understand what you're saying, Brian," Eva responded, kneeling down to his level. "And I know you're very brave. But you don't have to face this alone. We're all here to protect you, to take care of you. What you need to remember is that, despite everything, you still have the right to be just a boy. You still deserve to be happy." Brian looked at her, his eyes serious, but for a brief moment, he let his vulnerability show. "I just want this all to end," he murmured, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Eva hugged him, feeling the weight of all the emotions he was carrying. "It will end, Brian. I promise. But until then, we'll fight together." The tension in the shelter was almost palpable. Every night, Brian stayed alert to any noise, any unusual movement. Olivia tried to act normally, dedicating herself to her sewing course and maintaining as much normalcy as possible for Brian, but they both knew the calm was only temporary. Eva, always present, did her best to keep things calm, but even she knew something was coming. And on a cold, silent night, the threat finally revealed itself. It was late. The clock read nearly midnight when Brian woke up suddenly, his body tense as if he had sensed something was wrong. He got out of bed slowly, careful not to make a sound, and went to the window. The shelter's yard was dark, except for a faint light from one of the lamps near the entrance. That's when he saw it. 2 men near the fence, watching the shelter carefully, as if waiting for the right moment to act. Brian's heart started pounding. He knew what this meant. Those men were there because of Josh, and now they had found him and his mother. Without thinking twice, he ran to Olivia's room. "Mom," he whispered, shaking her. "Wake up, quickly." Olivia opened her eyes in alarm, seeing the panic in her son's eyes. "What is it, Brian? What's happening?" she asked, already getting up. "They're here. I saw 2 men in the yard. I think they're trying to get in." Terror gripped Olivia, but she knew she couldn't let fear paralyze her. Quickly, she grabbed Brian's hand and led him down the hallway toward Eva's room. Before they could knock, Eva was already awake, as if she had sensed the same thing. She opened the door, fully dressed and with her phone in hand. "I've already called the police," Eva said, trying to stay calm. "But we need to hide until they arrive. Quickly, come with me." Eva led them to a small room in the back of the shelter, where the women stored supplies for the courses and personal items. It was the safest place they could find while waiting. The sound of footsteps outside echoed, and the tension was unbearable. The fear that the men might break in at any moment made Brian's body tremble. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He felt he had to do something. "I can't just sit here, miss," Brian suddenly said, standing up. "What if they come in and hurt my mom?" Eva pulled him back, holding his shoulders firmly. "You've already done enough, Brian. Now let the police handle this." But Brian shook his head, the panic growing inside him. "What if they don't get here in time? I have to do something. I can't let them hurt her again." Eva held him tightly, looking directly into his eyes. "You're not alone, Brian. You don't have to carry this by yourself. We'll protect her. I promise." Before Brian could respond, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the shelter. The men were trying to break through one of the windows. Olivia gasped, pulling Brian closer, and Eva quickly locked the door to the room, blocking it with anything she could find. "The police are on their way," Eva repeated, trying to convince herself that everything would be fine. But Brian knew they had little time. The sound of the men breaking through the window grew louder. They were inside the shelter now, and their footsteps were getting closer. Brian felt his body freeze. He knew danger was about to reach them. The fear was overwhelming, but then an unexpected courage rose inside him. He couldn't let the past destroy them any longer. As the footsteps grew closer, Brian made a decision. He picked up a small piece of wood leaning against the corner of the room and approached the door, ready to do whatever it took to protect his mother. Eva tried to stop him. "Brian, no," she whispered, terrified. "You don't have to do this." But the boy had already decided. His look, determined and firm, left no room for doubt. "I won't let them hurt her again, Mississippi. I promise." The sound of footsteps finally reached the door where they were hiding. The men outside tried to open the locked door, but when they realized they couldn't, they began kicking it hard. The wood creaked, threatening to give way at any moment. Eva and Olivia braced for the worst, but before the men could break down the door, the sound of sirens echoed from outside the shelter. The police had finally arrived. The men hesitated, and the sound of voices and footsteps running outside filled the hallway. Brian dropped the piece of wood he was holding so tightly, and relief washed over him, though his body was still trembling. The police entered the shelter, arresting the two men who had tried to break in. Eva, Olivia, and Brian emerged from the room, still in shock, but the sense of safety and relief was immediate. The detective who had been following the case from the beginning came over to them after surveying the situation. "It's all over now," he said, looking at Brian with admiration. "We caught the two of them. They were here because of Josh. They wanted answers, but they won't be bothering you again." Brian felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He looked at his mother, who hugged him tightly as silent tears ran down her face. She knew they were finally free. Free from Josh's shadow, free from the fear that had haunted them for so long. Eva, watching the scene, felt a wave of pride for Brian. He had been through more than any child should ever have to face, but somehow, he had found the strength to protect his mother, just as he had promised. Days later, with the situation resolved and the men responsible behind bars, Olivia and Brian received good news. With Eva's help and the shelter's support, Olivia had secured a job at a small sewing shop in town. They finally had a chance to start fresh, far from violence and fear. On a sunny morning, as they walked down the street toward Olivia's new job, Brian felt a light breeze brush against his face. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something other than fear. There was a new beginning ahead of them, and although he knew the past would always be with them, he wouldn't let it define them. Eva, walking beside them, looked at Brian and smiled. "You were so brave, Brian. Never forget that." Brian looked at her and, for the first time, smiled back. There were still many scars, but deep down, he knew he had overcome something immense. And finally, he felt that the future didn't have to be as dark as the past. The end. What do you think of the story? What would you have done differently if you were Brian? Tell me in the comments.